The story begins in an old Victorian parlor, dimly lit by flickering candlelight, where shadows stretch unnaturally across the walls, clinging to the corners as though they are alive. The centerpiece of the room is a painting, large and imposing, its frame carved with intricate patterns that have dulled with age. On first glance, it seems like a conventional family portrait, a patriarch, a matriarch, and 3 children, posed stiffly in the style of the late 1800s. Yet something about the faces, particularly the eyes, creates a subtle sense of unease. The gaze of the figures appears almost alive, tracking movement with a quiet, unsettling precision. A faint hum seems to emanate from the canvas itself, a vibration that is almost imperceptible but lingers in the periphery of perception, felt rather than heard. It was during a rainy night, the kind that presses a heavy, suffocating weight against the windows, that the first scream occurred. Not a scream of pain or terror that could be heard down the street, but a scream that was intimate, private, almost a whisper of the soul, and only audible to the family members in the room. The matriarch, a woman of composed demeanor and deep-seated rationality, was the first to hear it. She froze mid-step, her hand gripping the armrest of a worn leather chair as the sound, or perhaps the sensation, washed over her. The names were spoken softly, in a voice that seemed to belong to no one and everyone at once, as if the air itself carried them. The matriarch later described the effect as both beautiful and horrifying, a melodic yet accusatory resonance that penetrated the core of her being. The patriarch, a stern man whose days were usually filled with meticulous record-keeping and correspondence, dismissed her initial reaction. Rationality demanded that it was a trick of the storm, the wind funneling through cracks in the old house, or the house settling with creaks and groans that occasionally sounded like human cries. Yet even he could not deny the strangeness when he later experienced it himself. Standing before the painting in the early hours of the morning, he felt the faint vibration against his chest, like a pulse originating from the canvas. The names whispered directly to him, names of ancestors long past, some unknown even to him, some of whom had been whispered about in family lore. The effect was immediate and disorienting, leaving him both fascinated and unnerved. The children, initially too young to fully comprehend, reacted in ways that ranged from curiosity to sheer terror. One of the younger daughters would sit at the edge of her bed, staring at the painting with wide, unblinking eyes, repeating in a monotone voice the names she claimed the painting had spoken to her. At first, the parents tried to rationalize it as imagination, perhaps the result of tales overheard or stories told by a nanny. But over time, the consistency of these experiences among multiple family members eroded any remaining skepticism. The whispers were not random, they were specific, coherent, and remarkably detailed. They referenced events, personalities, and secrets that could not have been common knowledge, deepening the mystery and the family's anxiety. No conventional explanation seemed to fit. There were no hidden speakers or phonographs, no drafts that could carry the sounds in such an ordered, deliberate manner. Attempts to recreate the effect were unsuccessful. Even when the painting was moved to different rooms, stored behind heavy curtains, or examined by neighbors, the phenomenon remained unique to the original family in the parlor. The implication was chilling, the painting seemed attuned not to the world at large, but to the private lives of those who lived under its gaze. This specificity created an intimate horror, as if the canvas were a sentient entity, aware of the deepest recesses of the household's history. The narrative deepens when one considers the timing and manner of the whispers. They never arrived as a simple announcement or call but instead appeared during moments of vulnerability. Late at night, when the mind was fogged with fatigue and imagination teetered on the edge of reality, during quiet, reflective afternoons when the air was heavy with anticipation, or in moments of grief, when the family confronted private losses. In each instance, the voices seemed to draw from the precise emotional state of the listener, adapting, shaping, and manipulating perception. They were not aggressive but persuasive, not overtly terrifying but irresistibly compelling, and impossible to ignore. Descriptions of the initial experiences emphasize both auditory and physical perception. Family members reported a coldness that seemed to emanate from the painting, settling over their shoulders, making their skin prickle and hearts race. Some felt an almost magnetic pull toward the canvas, an inexorable urge to stand before it and listen, as if drawn by invisible threads. Others described sensations akin to pressure or weight pressing against the chest, synchronized with the utterance of the names. The effect was cumulative. The more time spent near the painting, the more pronounced the reactions, creating a psychological environment charged with tension and anticipation. Letters and diaries later recovered from the household reveal that the family attempted to document these events meticulously. They wrote down every whisper, every odd sensation, and every detail of the painting's appearance, seeking patterns, rational explanations, or historical connections. These notes reveal both awe and terror, a duality that frames the central mystery. The family's emotional state ranged from reverent fascination to near panic, oscillating between the desire to understand and the instinct to flee. These records also hint at a growing obsession, a preoccupation with the painting that became central to family life, subtly redefining relationships, routines, and priorities. The opening sequence closes by highlighting the tension between disbelief and acceptance. Outsiders would find the claims absurd, the whispers could be written off as delusions, imagination, or hysteria. Yet for those inside the house, each moment was charged with undeniable reality. The painting did not merely hang as a decoration, it was a presence, a silent actor within the household drama, demanding attention and response. The first scream, the initial recognition of the whispers, marks the beginning of a slow descent into a world where ordinary rules of perception and reality no longer fully applied. The audience is left with a lingering sense of unease, compelled to continue, driven by curiosity, fear, and the need to uncover the full story behind the painting that screamed names only the family could hear. The story moves from the immediate terror of the whispers to the broader context of the family who lived with the painting for generations. The house itself stood at the end of Willow Lane, a narrow, winding road flanked by gnarled trees whose branches twisted toward the sky like skeletal fingers. Built in the late 1800s, the home was large, ornate, and imbued with the weight of time. Its brick facade had weathered decades of storms and sun, the mortar cracking in places where ivy had claimed the walls. Windows, tall and narrow, reflected the outside world in distorted angles, casting long shadows across the rooms inside. The front door, heavy and intricately carved, creaked under its own age, signaling a subtle, omnipresent reminder that the house had witnessed far more than the casual observer could ever know. The family that inhabited this house for generations had roots deeply entwined with the town itself. The patriarchal line traced back to merchants, local officials, and minor landowners who had shaped the community in subtle but enduring ways. Historical records indicate that the family carried a reputation of diligence, intellect, and sometimes stubborn pride. The matriarchal side contributed equal measures of refinement, social grace, and a noted preoccupation with art and culture. Together, these ancestral lines created a household that valued knowledge, propriety, and the preservation of family legacy, though beneath the surface, there were whispered rumors of eccentricities, rivalries, and inexplicable events, stories dismissed as gossip by outsiders but recorded meticulously in private letters and diaries. The painting arrived in the household under circumstances that remain partially obscured. According to family correspondence, it was commissioned by a distant relative who had traveled extensively across Europe. The artist, little known in contemporary records but described in letters as a man of singular vision, was rumored to have studied under masters who had dabbled in esoteric and occult practices. Some family members later suggested that the painting was not merely a portrait but a vessel, a conduit for unknown forces, though such claims were rarely voiced aloud and often recorded in fragmented diaries rather than official documents. The framing, materials, and subtle details of the artwork suggested extraordinary craftsmanship, with layers of oil and varnish so finely applied that some observers claimed to sense movement within the brushstrokes themselves. Life in the house prior to the first whispers seemed orderly and predictable. Meals were formal, conversations restrained, and daily routines rigidly observed. The family's social life involved careful interactions with neighbors and participation in town events, where appearances mattered as much as character. Yet, for all their outward normalcy, the household had always cultivated a certain isolation. Its position at the edge of the town, coupled with a subtle, almost unconscious desire for privacy, meant that rumors of minor oddities, doors closing on their own, fleeting shadows, inexplicable sounds, were largely ignored by outsiders. Within the walls of the house, however, these small disturbances were recorded, noted, and occasionally feared, setting the stage for the far stranger events that would come to dominate family life. Generational dynamics played a key role in the story. Each member experienced the painting differently, and the ways in which knowledge, fear, and superstition were passed down became central to the family's history. Older members tended toward rational explanations, seeking historical context, artistic precedent, or psychological reasoning to account for the anomalies. Younger members, particularly children, were more impressionable and emotionally susceptible, often perceiving the painting as alive, sentient, or even judgmental. These differences created tension, fostering both skepticism and heightened belief, while also establishing a pattern of intergenerational fear and obsession. Letters from grandparents and great-grandparents reveal a recurring theme, an acknowledgement of strange occurrences paired with a refusal to admit their true impact, a tension between pride, reason, and undeniable experience. The local town itself shaped the family's story in subtle ways. Willow Lane was not just a geographical location but a social microcosm of curiosity, caution, and suppressed intrigue. Neighbors were polite but distant, interacting with the family more out of obligation than genuine interest. Local folklore included stories of haunted estates, mysterious disappearances, and inexplicable sounds in the night, which lent credibility, at least in hushed conversations, to the notion that some households were touched by forces beyond explanation. While no one publicly accused the family of wrongdoing, subtle glances and whispers reinforced a sense of isolation and secrecy, creating an environment where the painting's influence could take root without immediate societal challenge. The architectural and atmospheric qualities of the house enhanced the psychological impact of the painting. Narrow hallways, creaking floorboards, and drafty rooms made ordinary sounds feel amplified, while the interplay of shadows and candlelight transformed ordinary furniture into grotesque shapes. The parlor, where the painting hung, was particularly suited to the phenomenon. It was a room designed for gatherings, yet its large windows faced east, capturing the dim morning light that slowly crept across the room and cast long, shifting shadows across the canvas. The placement of the painting, high above the mantelpiece, ensured that it dominated the room both visually and emotionally. Even in the absence of any supernatural phenomena, the house was psychologically potent, a stage perfectly constructed for fear, fascination, and slow-burning obsession. Family documents reveal that the household maintained meticulous records of events, both ordinary and unusual, which included detailed inventories of possessions, letters to distant relatives, and diaries describing daily life. Within these records, the painting is repeatedly mentioned, not only as an artwork but as a presence, a silent observer of family life. There are notes of subtle changes in the painting's appearance over time, shifts in color, the perception of movement in the eyes, and other anomalies that the family could not explain. These observations, written with the precision of both curiosity and dread, demonstrate a keen awareness of the painting's centrality to household life and foreshadow the psychological unraveling that would follow. By grounding the narrative in the history of the house, the lineage of the family, and the broader social environment, this section establishes a rich, immersive context. The house on Willow Lane is not merely a setting but an active participant in the story, shaping and amplifying the experiences of those who lived within it. The family, with its traditions, pride, and growing obsession, becomes a lens through which viewers can understand the intersection of ordinary life and inexplicable phenomena. The painting is positioned as both artifact and actor, while the house itself frames the unfolding drama, allowing the audience to sense the slow creep of unease and the intimate horror that will dominate the next chapters of the story. The first hints that the painting was more than a mere family portrait emerged subtly, almost imperceptibly, over the course of weeks. The anomalies began as minor disturbances, the kind that might easily be dismissed by a rational mind, the faintest of sounds, a draft that seemed too deliberate, or the occasional flicker of movement in the corner of the eye. At first, the family attributed these occurrences to ordinary causes. The Victorian house on Willow Lane had been built with imperfect materials, floorboards shifted with seasonal changes, and the old windows whistled under certain wind conditions. Yet as the phenomena continued, a pattern became increasingly difficult to ignore. The disturbances were not random, nor were they merely coincidental. They appeared to target specific individuals, moments, and emotions, creating a web of unease that began to infiltrate the household's daily life. The matriarch of the family was the first to document a pattern. One evening, while sitting alone in the parlor with the painting looming above the fireplace, she reported hearing a name whispered, so faintly it could have been imagined. Initially, she chalked it up to exhaustion, attributing the sound to a combination of storm winds and her own overactive imagination. Yet in the following days, as she moved about the house, the whispers returned, each time addressing her directly, and each time with a specificity that defied ordinary explanation. The voices were soft, almost musical, carrying a cadence that was at once soothing and accusatory, filling her with a mixture of curiosity, dread, and fascination. Other family members soon began reporting similar experiences, although each interpreted them through the lens of personal temperament. The patriarch, who had long relied on logic and order, initially denied any possibility that the painting could emit sounds. He insisted that any unusual noises were coincidental, perhaps the creak of the floorboards, the settling of the walls, or stray echoes from the street outside. Yet he, too, could not escape the painting's influence. On one particularly still night, while reviewing ledgers in the study, he paused mid-calculation, suddenly aware of a whispered name that resonated with a memory he had buried long ago. The name was of a distant ancestor, one who had died in obscurity, yet the voice articulated it with such precision that it left him questioning the boundary between reality and imagination. Children in the household experienced the phenomena with a raw, unfiltered intensity. One of the daughters, no older than 8, would awaken in the middle of the night, drawn inexplicably toward the parlor where the painting hung. Her small voice would repeat the names she claimed the painting had spoken, and her descriptions included details that none of the adults had shared with her. At first, parents dismissed her reactions as dreams or childish fantasy, a product of an overactive imagination fueled by bedtime stories. But over time, the consistency of her accounts, matched with those of older siblings and adults, revealed an eerie coordination that could not be explained away. The children's reports, although fragmented and at times confused, suggested an awareness of events, people, and connections that extended beyond their years, adding a layer of both psychological intrigue and terror. As the anomalies persisted, the family attempted to record them meticulously, hoping to find patterns, triggers, or rational explanations. Journals became repositories of whispered names, precise timings, and descriptions of the sensations accompanying each event. The family noted the presence of a cold draft that often accompanied the whispers, the subtle shifting of shadows in the parlor, and the inexplicable feeling of being watched. They began to map the events to specific locations within the house, noting that the parlor itself was the epicenter, with the influence diminishing the further one moved away. Even attempts to photograph or measure the phenomenon using scientific instruments yielded nothing, as though the painting operated on a plane beyond conventional detection. The specificity of the names called out by the painting was deeply unsettling. Unlike a random jumble of syllables or a cacophony of ghostly sounds, the voices seemed intimately familiar, addressing the family with knowledge of private histories. They spoke of ancestors whose lives had been lost to time, mentioning events, scandals, and personal secrets that were never publicly recorded. Some names referenced tragedies, moments of shame, or unspeakable acts, as if the painting itself had absorbed the entirety of the family's lineage, turning memory into sound. Each whisper carried emotional weight, a resonance that could not be dismissed as coincidence or imagination. The psychological impact was profound, leaving family members alternately awed, terrified, and increasingly obsessive. Attempts to rationalize these anomalies quickly became a family-wide obsession. The patriarch consulted historical texts and local archives, seeking references to the artist, the painting's creation, and any possible precedent for such phenomena. The matriarch researched folklore, occult practices, and the esoteric symbolism of portraiture, hoping to uncover hidden meaning or intentional design. Despite exhaustive investigation, no satisfactory explanation emerged. The more they sought answers, the more the painting seemed to assert its presence, its whispers adapting to the family's efforts to understand, as if aware of their attempts and resistant to them. The physical experience of the early anomalies was as significant as the auditory. Family members reported a chilling sensation that often accompanied the whispers, a coldness that seemed localized to the parlor and, at times, following individuals into adjacent rooms. Some felt pressure on their chests, a subtle but unmistakable weight that synchronized with the utterance of names. Shadows appeared to elongate and contort unnaturally, while reflections in the parlor's tall mirrors occasionally revealed fleeting, distorted images that vanished when observed directly. The combination of auditory, tactile, and visual phenomena created a multisensory effect, one that blurred the line between perception and reality and intensified the family's sense of vulnerability. Social interactions outside the household began to shift subtly. Family members, preoccupied with the painting's behavior, became withdrawn and distracted. Friends and neighbors noticed this change, interpreting it through their own perspectives, some as melancholy, others as eccentricity. The family, in turn, grew wary of outside commentary, fearing ridicule or disbelief, and increasingly isolated themselves. This withdrawal magnified the painting's influence, concentrating its effect within the household and allowing the anomalies to grow unchecked. Isolation, both self-imposed and socially reinforced, became a critical component of the developing narrative, underscoring the intimate and inescapable nature of the phenomena. By documenting the early anomalies in such detail, the family inadvertently amplified their own obsession. They cross-referenced experiences, noted patterns of timing and location, and sought correlations with historical events. Dreams became infused with whispered names, and waking thoughts were often preoccupied with anticipation of the next encounter. The painting had moved from being a passive object to an active force, shaping the household's consciousness and daily routine. It was no longer a portrait, it had become a presence, a silent, persistent agent influencing perception, emotion, and behavior in profound ways. This section also explores the interplay between belief and doubt. Each family member experienced the anomalies differently, filtered through their personal disposition and previous exposure to fear or rational explanation. The patriarch's skepticism clashed with the matriarch's growing conviction, while children responded instinctively, sometimes terrified, sometimes curious. These varying responses created tension, debate, and silent conflict, further heightening the household's charged atmosphere. The interplay of psychological, emotional, and environmental factors constructed a delicate lattice of suspense, establishing a slow-burning dread that would escalate as the story continued. The early anomalies, seemingly innocuous at first, thus laid the foundation for the larger, more terrifying events to come. They demonstrated that the painting's influence was both real and personal, targeting the individual as well as the family collective. They created a space where fear, curiosity, and obsession intertwined, setting the stage for the household's gradual descent into isolation, psychological strain, and confrontation with a force that defied rational explanation. By the conclusion of this section, the audience is fully immersed in the household's experience, compelled to follow the unfolding mystery, and aware that the whispers are not just sounds but a tangible presence with intent, specificity, and power. As the anomalies persisted, the story of the painting began to extend beyond the immediate family, though only in fragments and whispers. It was not long before other individuals, friends, distant relatives, and occasional visitors, encountered the phenomenon, though each experience varied in intensity and clarity. These encounters, unlike the family's constant exposure, were intermittent, which amplified both fear and fascination. Visitors would enter the parlor expecting a simple view of a family heirloom, perhaps an example of Victorian artistry, only to find themselves unsettled by the subtle, almost imperceptible presence that seemed to cling to the room. For many, it began as a quiet sensation, a draft, a chill, or the faint impression of being watched. Then, as if compelled by forces beyond comprehension, the whispers began, speaking names or phrases that were completely unknown to the listener yet profoundly specific to the family's history. The first witnesses were often family friends who arrived during social visits or formal dinners. One woman, a close friend of the matriarch, recalled sitting in the parlor with the painting dominating the room when she felt an inexplicable shiver crawl down her spine. As conversation lulled, she distinctly heard a name spoken in the space between thought and sound. It was not audible in the conventional sense but was perceived with startling clarity, resonating within her mind rather than her ears. She later described it as if the painting had reached out, selected her consciousness, and whispered a name from some hidden archive. Confused and disturbed, she questioned her own perception, yet her reaction was mirrored by other visitors over subsequent weeks. This pattern of selective, intimate contact suggested that the phenomenon was not universal but deliberately focused, targeting specific individuals in ways that defied logic. Visitors' accounts varied, often reflecting their prior beliefs, emotional state, and level of skepticism. Rational thinkers attempted to attribute the phenomenon to acoustics, imagination, or suggestion, only to find themselves confronted with experiences that resisted conventional explanation. Others, already inclined toward superstition or belief in the supernatural, interpreted the occurrences as proof of a haunting, a familial curse, or a sentient artwork. The intersection of skepticism and belief created a tension that the painting seemed to exploit, leaving each visitor with a personal version of the mystery, often tinged with lingering doubt and unease. Over time, these accounts accumulated, forming a tapestry of experiences that painted a picture of the painting's reach and influence. The impact on witnesses was not merely psychological but often physical. Many described the familiar sensations reported by the family, a subtle cold pressing against the body, a sudden tightness in the chest, or an inexplicable urge to approach the canvas. Some noted shadows that seemed to move independently, reflecting light in ways that contradicted natural angles, or glimpses of shapes that vanished when attention was directed. The most disturbing reports involved the names themselves, words that seemed to emerge from the ether, sometimes accompanied by a brief vision or image, a fragment of memory that did not belong to the visitor but felt unmistakably real. These sensations created an immediate, intimate connection between the witness and the painting, reinforcing the idea that the artwork was active, selective, and aware. Family members observed that the painting's behavior toward outsiders differed markedly from its interactions with them. While the family experienced constant whispers, escalating over time, visitors encountered intermittent contact, almost like a brief window into a reality otherwise reserved for those who lived within the house. This distinction heightened the tension within the household, as members began to question why the painting seemed to distinguish between insiders and outsiders, and what mechanism, if any, governed these selective communications. Letters and diaries reveal that the family oscillated between fear and fascination, wondering whether the painting's influence was growing stronger or merely revealing itself in calculated doses to those outside the immediate family. The most compelling witness accounts came from individuals with some prior familiarity with the family's history. These visitors reported not only the auditory phenomena but also the uncanny specificity of the names and details whispered. One cousin, visiting from a distant town, recounted hearing the name of a family member who had died decades earlier, followed by an event from that ancestor's life that he had never shared with anyone. These instances challenged conventional notions of memory, coincidence, and knowledge, suggesting that the painting functioned not merely as a passive object but as a vessel capable of perceiving and transmitting hidden truths. The credibility of these accounts was further reinforced by consistency across multiple witnesses, despite their varying backgrounds and personal beliefs. Witnesses also noted subtle behavioral cues from the family during these encounters. The matriarch would often pause mid-conversation, her gaze drawn involuntarily toward the painting, lips moving as if in silent communication. The patriarch, while outwardly composed, exhibited a tense, focused demeanor, his eyes following the canvas with an intensity that unsettled visitors. Children would occasionally appear entranced, repeating names under their breath with no apparent prompting. These observations contributed to the overall impression that the painting exerted influence beyond mere auditory phenomena, shaping mood, attention, and behavior in ways that reinforced the sense of pervasive presence. In some cases, visitors attempted to provoke or test the painting's response. One family friend brought a portable recorder, hoping to capture the whispers. Another attempted to rearrange furniture or block lines of sight, theorizing that proximity or orientation might influence the phenomenon. Yet these efforts yielded no consistent results. The painting's activity seemed impervious to physical manipulation or technological intervention, reinforcing the sense that it operated according to an unknown, possibly conscious logic. This unpredictability intensified fear, as even those well acquainted with the household were left unsure of what to expect, further amplifying suspense and psychological tension. Over time, these witness accounts contributed to a growing legend surrounding the house on Willow Lane. Though few dared to speak openly, the stories circulated quietly among townspeople, forming an undercurrent of fascination and apprehension. Those who had encountered the painting described it in hushed tones, careful to avoid ridicule or accusation, yet the cumulative weight of these experiences lent credibility to what outsiders might otherwise dismiss as imagination. The painting was no longer a family secret alone, it had become a quietly acknowledged mystery, an object of whispered speculation, yet one that remained largely inaccessible to scientific or rational inquiry. By the conclusion of this section, the narrative establishes that the painting's influence extends beyond the family, affecting outsiders in subtle, targeted ways. Witness accounts confirm the specific, intimate nature of the phenomenon, highlight its resistance to rational explanation, and reveal its ability to manipulate perception, emotion, and attention. These interactions deepen the story's psychological complexity, reinforcing the tension between belief and skepticism, normality and the extraordinary. The audience is left with a heightened sense of anticipation, understanding that the painting is not merely a passive artifact but an active, enigmatic presence, capable of reaching into the minds and memories of those who encounter it, and that the true scope of its influence remains profoundly uncertain. As the painting's influence became impossible to ignore within the household, the family found themselves facing not only internal turmoil but also external skepticism and denial. Neighbors, local clergy, and visiting officials were initially dismissive, treating the accounts of whispered names and unsettling sensations as exaggeration, imagination, or hysteria. The family's growing distress was met with polite concern rather than understanding, leaving them isolated and increasingly anxious. Conversations with clergy members, who were often called to offer guidance or blessings, tended to frame the phenomenon in moral or religious terms. They suggested that the family's fears were spiritual trials or tests of faith, urging prayers, ritualistic cleansing, or confession. While these measures offered temporary solace for some family members, they failed to account for the persistent specificity of the whispers, leaving doubt and unease unresolved. Public reaction was shaped by a combination of disbelief and the fear of social embarrassment. Townspeople, already accustomed to gossip and tales of odd occurrences, were willing to speculate but not to intervene. The family's experiences, once spoken aloud, were met with skepticism and subtle judgment. Rumors of hysteria or exaggeration circulated quietly, no one wanted to be associated with what could easily be interpreted as madness. This societal dismissal intensified the family's sense of isolation, reinforcing the idea that the house on Willow Lane, and the painting itself, was a world apart, where ordinary rules of perception and reason were insufficient. The family became increasingly wary of outsiders, speaking of the painting only in whispers and coded references, creating a culture of secrecy that amplified the mystery rather than dispelling it. Religious authorities played a complex role in this denial. Clergy who visited the household recognized the family's distress but interpreted it within a theological framework that emphasized sin, moral weakness, or the need for spiritual discipline. Some proposed rituals of exorcism or consecration, while others insisted that the painting be removed or hidden to prevent further disturbance. However, these interventions rarely succeeded in producing tangible results. The painting's whispers persisted, and its specificity remained intact. The family grew frustrated as their appeals for understanding were met with either ritualized gestures or clinical explanations that failed to acknowledge the lived reality of their experience. The tension between reason and belief became a central theme in this period. The patriarch, a man of measured logic, attempted to engage rational explanations, consulting scholars, historians, and art experts. These professionals approached the phenomenon with a combination of curiosity and skepticism, offering possible theories. Perhaps the painting contained hidden messages, subliminal cues, or was the product of an unusually meticulous technique. Yet none of these explanations could account for the auditory phenomena, nor could they explain the painting's apparent responsiveness to individual family members. The clash between scientific reasoning and unexplainable experience created frustration and fear, leaving the family trapped in a liminal space between logic and the inexplicable. Local authorities, when made aware of the family's claims, typically opted for non-intervention. Reports of disturbances were documented in town records, often accompanied by notes questioning credibility or mental stability. Attempts to involve law enforcement or civic officials rarely yielded practical action, as no tangible harm could be demonstrated and the events were confined largely to the private sphere of the home. The official silence and dismissal further reinforced the family's isolation, cementing the idea that the painting's influence existed in a realm untouched by ordinary authority or oversight. Cultural and social factors played a significant role in shaping this response. In a town steeped in tradition and cautious observation, public acknowledgement of the extraordinary was both socially risky and potentially dangerous. Families who drew attention to inexplicable events risked ostracism or ridicule, and the Willow Lane household was no exception. The combination of secrecy, public skepticism, and religious framing created an environment in which the family's experience was constantly contested, debated, and minimized, even as the reality of the phenomenon persisted unaltered. Despite this external denial, the painting's influence continued to assert itself within the household. The voices became more persistent, their specificity sharpened, and the emotional resonance intensified. Family members began to recognize that neither rational argument nor religious intervention could diminish the phenomenon. The painting seemed impervious to conventional explanations, reinforcing its central role as an active agent in the household's life. Each failed attempt to rationalize or suppress the experience only heightened the psychological tension, as the family realized that the world outside could neither comprehend nor control the forces operating within their home. Letters and diaries from this period reveal the family's growing frustration with both social and religious responses. They recorded feelings of isolation, desperation, and quiet rebellion against those who dismissed their experiences. At the same time, they meticulously documented every occurrence, every whispered name, and every unusual sensation, creating a record that reflected both fear and determination. This tension between outward compliance and private observation underscored the complexity of the household's experience, illustrating how social and religious pressures shaped, yet could not contain, the influence of the painting. The denial of reason also amplified internal conflict. The patriarch's insistence on logical analysis clashed with the matriarch's growing conviction that the phenomenon was beyond explanation. Children, sensitive to both adult tension and the painting's influence, reacted in ways that ranged from fear to obsession. These dynamics intensified household stress, illustrating how external skepticism could indirectly exacerbate the psychological impact of an inexplicable force. Each failed explanation or dismissive response from outsiders reinforced the sense that the painting operated outside the boundaries of ordinary life, its power amplified by disbelief and denial. By the conclusion of this section, the narrative emphasizes the dual struggle faced by the family, externally against societal and religious dismissal, and internally against mounting fear, doubt, and conflict. The interplay of skepticism, ritual, and isolation deepens the tension, demonstrating that the painting's influence is resilient precisely because it exists in a space ungoverned by conventional authority. The audience gains a clear understanding of the pressures shaping the household, the limitations of external intervention, and the growing inevitability of the psychological escalation that will dominate subsequent sections. The stage is set for the emotional and mental strain to intensify, as neither reason nor ritual can contain the whispered names that have begun to define life on Willow Lane. As the weeks and months passed, the family's encounters with the painting escalated beyond curiosity and unease, evolving into profound psychological strain. What had begun as faint whispers and subtle disturbances became increasingly intrusive, demanding attention and shaping the very rhythms of daily life. The parlor, once merely a room for social gatherings and quiet reflection, had transformed into a space of persistent tension, where the painting's presence was inescapable and its influence omnipresent. Family members reported being unable to move through the house without feeling its attention, as if the eyes of the painted figures followed their every gesture, and the faint hum of the whispers had become a constant companion, threading through thought and perception. The matriarch experienced the earliest signs of emotional escalation. Initially rational and composed, she began to find herself preoccupied with the painting, repeatedly returning to the parlor to listen, observe, and record each nuance of the whispers. Her journal entries reveal a mixture of fascination and dread, describing a compulsion she could neither resist nor fully understand. Sleep became fragmented. She awoke in the middle of the night, her mind haunted by names she had never consciously known. The whispers, she wrote, carried a tone that was both accusatory and mournful, a blend of warning and lamentation that unsettled her more profoundly than any tangible threat. Gradually, these experiences began to affect her emotional stability, creating irritability, anxiety, and moments of near panic when the painting's activity intensified. The patriarch, by contrast, wrestled with frustration and disbelief. A man who had relied on logic and reason throughout his life, he found the painting's behavior increasingly intolerable precisely because it defied explanation. Nights were restless, punctuated by dreams in which names were whispered with crystalline clarity, often accompanied by vivid images of ancestors and events he had long considered forgotten. His attempts to rationalize the phenomena, analyzing the artist's techniques, exploring possible acoustic effects, and consulting experts, provided only temporary relief. Each unanswered question, each failed attempt at explanation, intensified his sense of helplessness and mounting tension. The family's once orderly routines began to fray, the patriarch's authority undermined by the inexorable influence of the painting. Children in the household were particularly vulnerable to the painting's psychological impact. The youngest daughter, who had first heard names in whispers, began to exhibit symptoms of anxiety and hyperawareness. She would awaken in the middle of the night, trembling, and make her way silently to the parlor, repeating the names as though compelled to do so by an unseen force. Older siblings displayed signs of obsessive behavior, frequently discussing the painting, comparing notes, and attempting to anticipate the next whispered message. These patterns created tension within the family, as adults oscillated between attempts to reassure the children and their own growing sense of dread. The painting had begun to dominate not only perception but behavior, shaping how the household moved, interacted, and thought. The emotional and psychological strain extended beyond fear to profound alterations in attention, perception, and cognition. Family members reported a heightened sensitivity to sound and movement, as if the painting had sharpened their awareness of otherwise mundane stimuli. Ordinary noises, a creaking floorboard, a distant footstep, were magnified, interpreted through the lens of the painting's influence. Shadows seemed to lengthen and shift unnaturally, and reflections in mirrors occasionally appeared distorted, reinforcing a pervasive sense of unreality. Even when attempting to focus on daily tasks, the family found themselves distracted, drawn repeatedly to the parlor, unable to resist the magnetism of the canvas. Physical manifestations accompanied the psychological changes. Some family members described tightness in the chest, coldness that spread through the limbs, and a prickle of tension along the spine whenever names were whispered. Sleep deprivation and heightened emotional states led to fatigue, irritability, and occasional confusion. Yet these physical sensations were not uniform, they varied depending on who was present, the time of day, and the intensity of the whispering. This inconsistency amplified fear, creating a sense that the painting's influence was deliberate, targeted, and unpredictable. The family began to recognize that resistance was futile, as the painting operated on an invisible logic, indifferent to human understanding or control. Attempts to mitigate the psychological effects often backfired. Moving the painting to a different room produced temporary relief, yet the whispers seemed to follow certain individuals, appearing even in bedrooms or private studies. Covering the painting or restricting access heightened anxiety, as absence only seemed to intensify the family's anticipation and fear. Each interaction reinforced the painting's centrality to household life, creating a feedback loop in which attention magnified influence, and influence demanded attention. The house itself, with its narrow hallways, creaking floors, and dim lighting, amplified these effects, making the ordinary extraordinary and the familiar uncanny. The matriarch's diaries reveal the emotional toll with precision. She documented moments of despair, fleeting relief, and obsessive recording of every occurrence. There were passages describing tears shed silently in the parlor, hands trembling as she attempted to transcribe the whispered names, and bouts of frustration when the voices ceased or changed unexpectedly. These records illustrate a slow erosion of emotional stability, highlighting the interplay between fascination, terror, and compulsion. Her experiences reflect a universal psychological truth: when confronted with phenomena that defy understanding, the mind becomes both a witness and a participant, susceptible to obsession and emotional instability. The patriarch's writings offer a complementary perspective, revealing the intellectual struggle against helplessness. He meticulously noted the times, durations, and content of the whispers, analyzing them with a precision born of desperation. His efforts to categorize and rationalize the occurrences reveal a mind battling both external mystery and internal doubt. Yet even as he pursued reason, he could not escape the profound effect on his emotional state: irritability, occasional panic, and a pervasive sense of vulnerability. The family's psychological landscape was being reshaped, each member influenced uniquely yet collectively bound by the painting's persistent presence. By the end of this period, it became clear that the painting had transcended its role as a static object. It had become an active psychological force, shaping thought, behavior, and emotional equilibrium. The family's life was now dominated by the parlor, the canvas, and the whispers, which had grown louder, more specific, and increasingly demanding. Emotional responses oscillated between terror, fascination, and obsessive engagement, demonstrating the painting's capacity to infiltrate consciousness, manipulate perception, and undermine rational stability. This escalation sets the stage for further developments, illustrating the intersection of fear, obsession, and compulsion. The psychological impact is no longer subtle, it is profound, pervasive, and undeniable. The audience is drawn into the household's experience, witnessing not only external manifestations but the internal unraveling of mind and spirit. Each whisper, each glance, and each shadow contributes to a slow-burning tension that prepares the narrative for the eventual attempts at explanation and confrontation with forces that defy ordinary comprehension. As the psychological strain on the family intensified, a desperate need for understanding emerged. The whispers, the coldness, the shadows, and the inexplicable specificity of the names demanded an explanation that went beyond fear or superstition. The patriarch, a man of logic and methodical thinking, spearheaded a series of investigations, hoping to find rational causes for the phenomena. He began by analyzing the painting itself in painstaking detail, examining the brushwork, pigments, and materials. He consulted art historians and restoration experts, searching for hidden compartments, secret inscriptions, or unusual techniques that might account for the apparent lifelike quality of the eyes or the subtle vibrations in the canvas. While these experts admired the craftsmanship and occasionally speculated on esoteric influences in the artist's training, none could offer an explanation for the auditory whispers or their selective, personalized nature. Scientific approaches were also attempted. The family acquired early recording devices, thermometers, and rudimentary instruments to measure temperature fluctuations, sound vibrations, and electromagnetic anomalies. Experiments were conducted at different times of day, under varying lighting conditions, and with different household members present. Despite careful observation, nothing measurable or repeatable was found. The whispers and sensations persisted, often seeming to respond to attention itself. The more they tried to document or quantify the phenomenon, the more intense and deliberate it became. This lack of measurable evidence only heightened the sense of helplessness, leaving the family torn between the hope of rational understanding and the terror of an unexplainable presence. Historical research provided some context but few answers. Letters, diaries, and local archives were combed for records of the artist, previous owners, and events surrounding the painting's creation. Some findings hinted at connections to esoteric or occult practices, though these remained speculative. The family discovered that the artist had traveled extensively, studying under teachers who dabbled in mystical and philosophical traditions. This information offered a tantalizing clue: perhaps the painting was intended as more than a portrait, a vessel for memory or consciousness. Yet the historical record was fragmented, leaving critical gaps, and scholars dismissed most conjecture as romantic speculation rather than evidence. The sense of mystery only deepened, blending documented history with rumor and family legend. Religious and spiritual explanations were also explored, reflecting both desperation and cultural context. Clergy who visited the house suggested that the painting might serve as a conduit for ancestral spirits or a test of moral fortitude. Rituals were attempted: prayers, blessings, and even temporary concealment of the painting. These interventions occasionally provided brief relief, but the whispers soon resumed, unaltered and undiminished. Spiritual guidance offered a framework for interpreting the events, yet it did little to satisfy the family's need for tangible understanding or predictability. The coexistence of religious, historical, and scientific inquiry created a complex mosaic of approaches, each revealing part of the mystery while leaving the core enigma intact. Psychological and medical interpretations were considered as well. Doctors and early psychiatrists were consulted to determine whether the family's experiences could be explained by shared delusion, hysteria, or heightened suggestibility. While some symptoms, such as sleep disturbances, anxiety, and obsessive focus, were noted, these explanations failed to account for the specificity of the names, the consistency across multiple family members, and the corroboration of witness accounts outside the household. The limitations of contemporary psychology meant that no professional could fully explain the phenomenon without dismissing it entirely, which only intensified the family's frustration and growing sense of alienation from conventional understanding. The family's documentation grew increasingly systematic. Diaries, ledgers, and notebooks were organized to track patterns, timing, and content of the whispers. Cross-referencing revealed subtle trends. Certain names appeared repeatedly during times of emotional stress or reflection, while others were associated with specific locations within the parlor. The family speculated about symbolic meaning, ancestral memory, or psychic resonance. These attempts at pattern recognition provided a measure of control, allowing them to structure their observations, yet they offered no resolution. The painting remained an active agent, unyielding to rational categorization or experimental inquiry. Despite the absence of definitive explanations, these attempts revealed important insights into the nature of the phenomenon. First, it was clear that the painting's influence was persistent and targeted, responding differently to individuals and circumstances. Second, conventional methods, whether scientific, historical, religious, or psychological, were insufficient to contain or fully explain the effects. Third, the family's efforts to understand and control the painting paradoxically seemed to intensify its presence, suggesting that engagement itself was a trigger, a form of unintentional interaction with an agency that defied ordinary comprehension. The emotional impact of these investigative efforts was profound. Each failed attempt at explanation deepened the household's sense of vulnerability and unease. Hope and despair alternated in rapid succession. A promising discovery in historical research or a new scientific method was often followed by frustration and fear when the phenomenon persisted unabated. These cycles created a feedback loop, reinforcing obsession, hyperawareness, and emotional instability. The painting had moved from passive object to active participant, shaping not only perception but behavior, attention, and expectation. By the end of this period, the family understood that the search for explanation might never yield a definitive answer. The phenomenon existed in a liminal space, at the intersection of reality, perception, and memory. Rational, religious, and scientific frameworks offered insight, yet none could fully encompass the painting's complexity or influence. This recognition did not bring peace; instead, it intensified the sense of mystery, compelling the family to continue their meticulous documentation, wary observation, and psychological endurance. The audience witnesses a household grappling with forces beyond ordinary understanding, caught between the human desire for explanation and the inexorable reality of an enigmatic presence that resists comprehension. As the painting's influence persisted, the household began to fracture under the weight of its relentless presence. What had started as unease and fascination evolved into tension, fear, and ultimately isolation. The family's once orderly routines were disrupted, replaced by compulsive behaviors centered on monitoring, documenting, and anticipating the whispers. Meals were taken in silence, conversations often faltered mid-sentence, and the children withdrew into quiet observation, frequently wandering toward the parlor to witness or record the names spoken. The house itself seemed to respond to this heightened state, the creaking of floors and shifting shadows amplifying the sense of pressure and confinement. The physical and emotional environment of Willow Lane became inseparable from the psychological strain, each reinforcing the other in an escalating cycle of stress. The matriarch, once composed and rational, experienced profound emotional strain. She became preoccupied with the parlor and the painting to the point of near obsession, spending hours documenting every subtle movement, every whisper, and every change in atmosphere. Sleep was irregular and fragmented, with nightmares frequently merging into waking experiences, blurring the boundaries of perception. Her emotional stability deteriorated as the whispers became increasingly insistent, often repeating names associated with familial secrets, long-buried scandals, or tragedies that had been purposefully forgotten. These invocations of past events not only disturbed her peace but also created a sense of inescapable judgment, as if the painting was a silent arbiter of the family's collective conscience. The patriarch's rationalism proved increasingly inadequate in the face of persistent anomaly. His attempts to analyze, document, and rationalize were met with repeated frustration. Every methodical approach, historical research, scientific measurement, consultation with experts, failed to yield conclusive results. The persistence of the phenomenon, combined with the growing emotional instability of his family, eroded his authority and confidence. Where once he could maintain order and composure, he now found himself reactive, often startled by minor disturbances that previously would have gone unnoticed. His attempts to shield the family from external scrutiny intensified internal tension, as the pressure to maintain normalcy collided with the painting's unyielding influence. Children in the household began displaying behaviors indicative of deep psychological stress. The youngest daughter, who had first perceived the whispers, became fixated on the parlor, repeating names aloud and insisting that she could hear them even when the room is empty. Older siblings engaged in obsessive documentation, sometimes cross-referencing diaries, letters, and whispered messages for hours. These behaviors blurred the line between curiosity and compulsion, illustrating the subtle yet profound ways in which the painting had infiltrated daily life. Their reactions were not merely imaginative, they were rooted in an unshakable perception of the painting as a sentient presence capable of communication, judgment, and observation. The physical environment of the house reinforced this psychological strain. Shadows seemed longer and more distorted, especially in the parlor where the painting hung. Ambient noises, wind through narrow windows, the settling of floorboards, the distant hum of the street, were magnified and interpreted through the lens of the painting's presence. Rooms once considered neutral or restful became psychologically charged spaces, their atmospheres shifting with the intensity of the whispers. Even light seemed to behave differently, casting uneven reflections that contributed to a sense of disorientation and unease. The household's lived reality became inseparable from the painting's influence, each element of the environment amplifying fear and obsession. Isolation became both a consequence and a strategy. The family, wary of ridicule, disbelief, or intrusion, increasingly withdrew from neighbors, friends, and extended relatives. Public visits dwindled, social invitations were declined, and the house at the end of Willow Lane became a fortress of secrecy. While this isolation provided a measure of protection from external judgment, it also intensified internal stress. Without external perspective or validation, the family's experiences and fears grew unchecked, magnified by proximity and constant exposure. Isolation, both voluntary and circumstantial, allowed the painting's influence to dominate thought and behavior, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of psychological tension. The household also experienced subtle internal conflict, a breakdown of communication and trust. Differing interpretations of the painting's activity, between skepticism and conviction, rationalism and belief, created tension. Arguments flared over whether to continue documenting, attempt concealment, or seek external help. Disagreements that might once have been minor escalated under the pressure of the painting's influence, illustrating how external phenomena can exacerbate internal discord. Even attempts at comforting or guiding one another were undermined by the persistent, intrusive nature of the whispers, which seemed to exploit insecurities, fears, and disagreements for maximum psychological impact. Attempts to mitigate the influence through removal, concealment, or ritual were largely unsuccessful. Moving the painting to another room or covering it provided only brief respite. Prayers and blessings, though spiritually significant for some family members, failed to suppress the whispers or the associated sensations. The painting appeared impervious to direct intervention, its presence undiminished regardless of physical, spiritual, or psychological strategies. These failed efforts reinforced the sense of helplessness, highlighting the painting's capacity to operate independently of human control and intensifying the family's dependency on documentation, observation, and cautious engagement. By the end of this period, the household had reached a breaking point. Emotional fatigue, anxiety, and hyper-awareness dominated daily life, while social withdrawal and internal conflict created an almost hermetic environment. The family's reality had narrowed to the house, the painting, and the whispers, with every thought, action, and emotion filtered through the lens of the parlor. The painting had transcended its role as a mere object, it had become an agent of psychological influence, shaping perception, behavior, and interpersonal dynamics in profound ways. This section underscores the transformative effect of sustained exposure to an inexplicable phenomenon. The collapse of routine, the intensification of fear, and the retreat into isolation illustrate how a single object can dominate thought, emotion, and social engagement. The audience witnesses a household in the grip of an inescapable force, where normality has been subsumed by obsession, and where every action, decision, and relationship is subtly guided by an entity that exists at the intersection of perception, memory, and mystery. The stage is set for the next phase, where the consequences of this psychological collapse will reach their fullest expression, and the long-term effects of isolation and obsession become impossible to ignore. The household on Willow Lane, once a hub of familial warmth and social interaction, had transformed into a fortress of silence and secrecy. By the time the painting's influence reached its full intensity, the family had largely withdrawn from the outside world, their lives consumed by the whispers, shadows, and subtle pressures that emanated from the canvas. Neighbors noted the absence of visitors, the dimming of lights in previously cheerful windows, and the hushed voices that occasionally leaked through closed doors. Rumors began to circulate quietly, whispered among townspeople who were both fascinated and apprehensive. Yet these stories, while intriguing, were never fully substantiated, leaving the town to maintain an uneasy equilibrium, acknowledgement through silence, fascination tempered by fear. The aftermath of the household's descent into obsession was multifaceted, affecting both the family and the wider community. Within the home, the family's relationships were fundamentally altered. Emotional bonds, once reinforced by shared experience and affection, became strained under the weight of isolation and fear. The children, hyper-aware of the painting's influence, often mirrored their parents' tension, perpetuating cycles of anxiety and obsessive attention. Moments of play or joy were rare and brief, always interrupted by the compulsion to return to the parlor, to record whispered names, or to anticipate the next interaction with the enigmatic canvas. Even mundane routines, meal preparation, correspondence, or chores, were performed with heightened attention to the potential presence of the whispers, transforming ordinary tasks into rituals of vigilance. The matriarch's obsession deepened in this period, manifesting in both meticulous documentation and emotional withdrawal. Her journals grew voluminous, filled with names, times, sensations, and reflections on the psychological impact of the painting. She often spent hours in silent contemplation before the canvas, absorbing every nuance of light, shadow, and color, as if attempting to decode a language that existed beyond comprehension. Sleep deprivation, anxiety, and emotional fatigue became routine, yet she persisted, driven by a combination of fear, curiosity, and compulsion. Her experience illustrates a central element of the phenomenon, the painting's ability to draw attention, energy, and cognition toward itself, shaping thought patterns and emotional responses with unrelenting precision. The patriarch, burdened by both rational inquiry and familial responsibility, experienced a different form of deterioration. While maintaining outward composure, he grew increasingly isolated in thought, spending long hours analyzing patterns, consulting historical records, and attempting to reconcile scientific and anecdotal evidence. His sense of control eroded as every methodical approach failed to produce definitive answers, leaving him both frustrated and terrified. Letters and personal notes reveal a man caught between disbelief and the undeniable reality of the painting's influence, his internal struggle emblematic of the broader tension between reason and experience. The broader community, meanwhile, responded with a mixture of curiosity and deliberate avoidance. The household's withdrawal and the rumors surrounding the painting created a social boundary. Townspeople were cautious, respectful, or fearful, rarely engaging directly with the family or the house. Occasional observers reported fleeting glimpses of activity, a dim light moving through curtained windows, or hurried figures entering the parlor, but no one could corroborate the experiences of the family. This collective silence reinforced the painting's mystique, transforming it into a symbol of the unknown, a private terror that existed at the edge of shared reality. The phenomenon, though intensely personal to the family, became a point of collective fascination precisely because it remained largely inaccessible. Attempts to involve outside authorities, clergy, scholars, or investigators, were limited and largely ineffective. Those who did visit were confronted with a combination of emotional intensity, meticulous documentation, and phenomena that defied conventional understanding. The painting's whispers, selective and specific, continued even in the presence of outsiders, creating an experience that was at once compelling and incomprehensible. Reports from these visits were inconsistent, anecdotal, and often dismissed as unreliable by wider society. Consequently, the painting's influence remained contained within the household, yet its legend spread quietly, carried by fragmented accounts and subtle social acknowledgement. The family's isolation was both a cause and a consequence of the painting's continued power. With limited external validation, every experience became amplified, every whisper more significant, every shadow more menacing. Emotional and psychological energy was concentrated on observation and documentation, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of attention and influence. Family members found themselves unable to escape the rhythms of the parlor, the cadence of whispered names, or the psychological weight of persistent surveillance. The house itself, with its creaking floors and narrow hallways, became a physical manifestation of the isolation, a structure shaped by and reinforcing the painting's pervasive influence. Subtle social interactions also reflected the lingering impact. Even when members ventured outside the household, they carried an acute awareness of the painting's presence and potential influence. Their speech, behavior, and engagement with neighbors were often restrained, measured, or distracted, as if anticipating the next encounter with the unseen agency in the parlor. Over time, the family's experiences seeped into local lore, filtered through rumor and partial observation, yet always retaining an element of ambiguity. The town recognized the household's transformation without fully understanding it, maintaining a delicate balance between interest and avoidance, fascination and fear. The long-term effect of this local silence was the preservation of mystery. The painting, though central to the family's psychological reality, became a private enigma, shielded from complete social scrutiny. Stories circulated selectively, shared in hushed tones or fragmented accounts, ensuring that the broader community remained intrigued but uninvolved. This collective discretion, whether motivated by respect, fear, or disbelief, reinforced the painting's mystique, allowing it to exist as a phenomenon both intensely personal and culturally resonant. By the end of this period, the aftermath of the household's descent into obsession had taken shape, emotionally fractured, socially isolated, and psychologically strained, the family remained captive to the whispers and shadows that defined life on Willow Lane. Yet their experience left a lingering resonance in the local consciousness, a quiet acknowledgement of a force that defied rational explanation and persisted despite skepticism, intervention, or ritual. The painting, though contained physically within a single parlor, had achieved a presence that extended beyond walls, influencing memory, storytelling, and collective perception. The stage was set for enduring questions, speculative theories, and the unresolved tension between what is seen, what is heard, and what remains beyond comprehension. Even after decades had passed, the painting on Willow Lane resisted all attempts at explanation, leaving the family, the local community, and later generations of scholars and witnesses with more questions than answers. The cumulative experiences, the whispered names, the shifting shadows, the inexplicable cold, and the selective psychological impact, defied conventional understanding and challenged the boundaries between perception, memory, and reality. By the time the household had reached a fragile equilibrium, it was clear that no single approach, scientific, historical, spiritual, or psychological, could fully account for the phenomenon. What remained were theories, hypotheses, and speculation, each offering partial insight but none providing closure, leaving the painting suspended in a space between known and unknown. One of the earliest lines of inquiry focused on ancestral memory and the concept of generational consciousness. Scholars and amateur researchers speculated that the painting might somehow contain or channel the cumulative experiences of the family's forebears, manifesting as whispered names and evocative sensations. Proponents of this theory pointed to the specificity of the names and the apparent knowledge of private family events as evidence that the canvas functioned as a repository of memory. While compelling in narrative terms, this theory struggled to reconcile the selective interaction with outsiders and the painting's persistence even under observation, raising questions about the mechanisms behind such a phenomenon and whether it was purely psychological or something beyond ordinary cognition. Another prevailing theory involved psychic resonance or the presence of an unknown consciousness. This hypothesis suggested that the painting was not merely a passive object but an active entity capable of perceiving, recording, and transmitting information to select individuals. Advocates of this idea drew upon the documented patterns of interaction, the way the painting seemed to respond to attention, the variations in intensity based on who was present, and the capacity to evoke specific memories or names. Skeptics, however, questioned the validity of anecdotal evidence, pointing out the limitations of subjective perception and the potential for cognitive bias. Yet even with rigorous scrutiny, no explanation fully accounted for the intricate and consistent patterns reported over decades, leaving the phenomenon open to interpretation. Historical research offered tantalizing but inconclusive evidence. The artist who created the painting had traveled extensively, studied under mentors with esoteric or mystical leanings, and maintained detailed journals that hinted at experiments with memory, perception, and human consciousness. Some entries suggested a deliberate intention to imbue the artwork with a form of sentient awareness, while others were ambiguous, reflecting the language and mysticism of the period. These records, though fragmentary, provided context that seemed to support theories of intentional design or arcane knowledge. Yet the absence of corroborating documentation, coupled with the impossibility of verifying the painting's precise creation process, left these insights tantalizing but inconclusive. Religious and spiritual frameworks continue to offer interpretive possibilities. Clergy and spiritual scholars suggested that the painting could serve as a conduit for ancestral spirits, divine judgment, or protective forces, its activity a reflection of moral or metaphysical law. This interpretation provided meaning within a theological context, framing the whispers and psychological impact as purposeful rather than arbitrary. Critics of this approach, however, noted that it relied heavily on belief systems and could not produce measurable or replicable evidence. Despite this, the spiritual lens persisted as a compelling narrative tool, allowing the family and subsequent observers to reconcile the inexplicable with existing frameworks of understanding. Psychological and medical theories offered yet another perspective. Contemporary analysis considered shared delusion, heightened suggestibility, and obsessive-compulsive responses as potential explanations for the persistent phenomena. While these Models could account for certain behaviors, hyper-awareness, obsessive documentation, emotional volatility. They fell short in explaining the specificity of the names, the corroboration of independent witness accounts, and the reported sensations experienced by visitors with no prior connection to the family. The interplay of belief, perception, and environmental cues provided partial insight but could not fully encompass the phenomenon, reinforcing the sense that something extraordinary was at work. Modern investigations, including forensic art analysis and acoustic studies, sought empirical evidence, scanning the painting for hidden layers, chemical anomalies, or acoustic properties that could account for the whispers. These investigations revealed no physical mechanism for the auditory phenomena. The pigments and brushwork, while exquisite, were conventional for the period, offering no indication of hidden devices or manipulations. Acoustic testing failed to detect any source for the selective auditory effects. Each scientific endeavor, though meticulous and methodologically sound, concluded with the acknowledgement that the painting's influence was neither fully explainable nor entirely understandable by contemporary standards. A particularly compelling aspect of the mystery is the painting's enduring ability to evoke questions across generations. Descendants of the family, historians, and casual observers alike continue to be drawn to the narrative, documenting experiences, revisiting the house, and analyzing historical records. Each new encounter adds layers of anecdotal evidence, personal reflection, and cultural interpretation, yet the fundamental enigma remains. The phenomenon resists simplification, defying attempts to categorize it within the boundaries of art, psychology, history, or spirituality alone. Its power lies in persistence, subtlety, and the way it intersects with human perception, memory, and emotion. The painting also raises profound philosophical questions. Is it a repository of consciousness, a conduit for memory, or a deliberately constructed artifact designed to provoke response? Does it possess agency, or is its impact entirely mediated by perception and attention? Can the phenomenon be studied objectively, or is it inherently subjective, a unique interplay between observer and object? These questions persist because the phenomenon does not conform to the expectations of ordinary reality, leaving both scholars and lay observers suspended in uncertainty. Ultimately, the painting of Willow Lane stands as a symbol of enduring mystery. Its whispers, shadows, and psychological influence challenge the boundaries of knowledge, blending elements of art, history, psychology, and spirituality into an enigma that resists resolution. The family's experience, documented meticulously yet inevitably partial, provides a window into the phenomenon's profound effects on perception, behavior, and social interaction. Each theory offers partial insight, but none can fully explain the complexity, specificity, and persistence of the painting's influence. By the conclusion of this section, the audience is left with a sense of awe and uncertainty. The painting's legacy is one of questions without answers, of persistent intrigue that spans generations. Its story illustrates the tension between the human desire for understanding and the enduring power of the inexplicable. The phenomenon is simultaneously personal and universal, intimate in its specificity yet broadly resonant in its mystery. The enduring whispers, the untraceable patterns, and the silent influence of the painting ensure that its story remains unresolved, a testament to the limits of knowledge and the persistence of wonder, fear, and fascination.